Welcome to Everyday Saints. I'm Valerie Lovelace, and with me today I have Dustin Peterson. Dustin is a bit of an expert on talents, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about talents and how to find them, how to cultivate your talents, what are the things holding you back from your talents. Dustin, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Valerie. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, so explain to me, how did you become a talent guru?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Appreciate you having me on the podcast today. So a number of years ago, and by a number I mean like 20 years ago, I graduated from Brigham Young University, Idaho, and did the thing that everybody's supposed to do, which is to go and get a job. And I could not probably have picked a worse job at the time for who I was. I didn't know that at the time, but I just picked something somewhat arbitrarily and ended up in a career that was very, very painful. So painful, in fact, that it brought me to tears. I came home from work one day and I'd been hating my job for maybe 9 months and couldn't figure out why. And I was talking to my wife. I remember she was 7 months pregnant with our first child, and she was standing in the kitchen cooking something over a hot stove, hand on a pot of boiling water, which was a dangerous time to tell her that I absolutely hated my job. And she said, "Hey, how was work today?" And I said, "It was okay." And she said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Oh, nothing." And she said, "I can tell something's wrong." And I slinked down the wall, 6'5", 200-pound body, slinked down the wall into the fetal position and began to cry. And I'm not a crier, Valerie. If you knew me well, you would know that I've only cried like 3 times in the past decade of my life, and it's usually physically pain induced from my children. But I started to cry, and she said, "What is wrong?" And I said, "I hate my job." And she says, so what are we doing? Why are you doing it? And I said, "I just don't know what else to do." And she said, "You know what? Then let's quit and let's go figure this out. Let's go find a better way." And so I felt like, I've got to figure this out. I've got to figure out what to do with my life. So I began to pray about that and study it and think about it. And I came across two verses of scripture that ended up being incredibly powerful for me. The first is from the Book of Mormon, from Second Nephi. It says, "Adam fell that men might be, and men are that they might have joy." That moment I thought, we are in existence to have joy. I should have joy. You should have joy. And every one of us should feel that. So why don't I feel any joy? And the second verse I came across, I cross-referenced it over to Matthew 25, which is the parable of the talents. And in that parable, it says that God gave every person talents, and those who went and magnified them entered the joy of the Lord. And those who did not were kind of cursed and cast off. And I felt cast off, and I didn't believe God had cast me off, but I felt that I had in some way not magnified my talents. And in that moment, I thought, wow, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be happy. I'm supposed to find joy. Talents seem to be the key. So why don't I know what mine are? And that's what kind of brought me along the path and got me starting to think about talents.
Interesting. Okay, so you're not doing that soul crushing job anymore. So obviously you figured this out and now you're helping other people along the way. You literally wrote the book about it. It's called Talented: Discovering and Using Your God-Given Talents to Find More Joy in Life. So let's just jump right into it. Let's just start talking about, first of all, what I want to know is, why are talents so important to LDS people? We talk about it in church a lot. It's a very important part of is it our culture or our doctrine?
Yeah. It is a part of both our culture and our doctrine, because we believe that God created every individual to be unique and different, to have value to add to the world. And we're taught that we have this divine nature. And we're even taught from prophets and apostles that before we ever came to earth, we were endowed with talent. And our whole job, or our whole mission in this life, is to discover what those things are, or rediscover them and go put them to use. So for sure, it's a part of our culture as well. In their culture of the church, look, talent is what differentiates us. If you line up every Relief Society president or every Elders Quorum president, every one of them has the same responsibilities, but they ought to be doing it very different. And the differentiator are talents. If you can figure out what your talents are, that's what you bring to your calling. That's what you bring to your work. That's what sets you apart. So you're never going to meet two people that do it the same way. I think about a good friend I have named Randy. He lives here in the Houston area where I live, and he was our stake executive secretary. And you would think that that calling is all about setting appointments and keeping minutes and keeping things organized, but he found a way to teach and train and coach and help and assist. And he found all these ways to bring his talents to the work, made all the difference. So absolutely, it's powerful for LDS people to discover their talents. In fact, God wants us to do it. He's asked us to do it. It's our whole mission. And in Doctrine and Covenants, I remember reading that he was not pleased with some people because they buried their talents. So Valerie, I think it's fundamental for LDS folks to figure this out.
And I mean, there's that parable of the talents, and that's, I think, represented on your book cover as well, isn't it? With the gold coins
That's right.
across the front. Um, it's so interesting to me how much we talk about it, but I mean, it is a major part of our doctrine that we are valued as individuals. So it makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. It makes a lot of sense, and you don't find that in a lot of other places in the world, in a lot of other organizations, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And it's also a bit alarming to me how few of us know what those are. Every one of us has talent. Everybody has them. I've never met a single person that doesn't, and I don't think anybody got left out in the pre-existence. I sometimes joke with people who say I don't have any talents. I say, "Do you think you like stepped out of line in the pre-existence to grab a burger or a bite to eat while the rest of us were getting our talents?" No, everybody has them. And so the alarming thing is, why don't we know them? There's so much a part of us. What's getting in the way? So I want to talk about that for just a moment, if that'd be okay. I've come across
Yeah,
a couple of
definitely.
things that I found get in the way of identifying talent. These are consistent. I see them across anybody I coach or train. The first concept is called the deficit perspective. And the deficit perspective is this idea that we pay more attention to what's broken about us, to what's left out, to what we're not good at than what we are good at, to what's left
That's so true.
in. Isn't that it's so interesting why we do that? And if you don't think you do it, if you're listening, if you have a job and you got a performance review at the mid-year or the end of the year, then you know what I mean, because what you did is you skipped right past the strengths and you went to the weaknesses section and said, what do I need to do to improve? Just recently, I was doing a 360 review for one of my clients where I contacted all these people on his behalf to give feedback. And I built out this beautiful report for him. And I got on the phone with him and I said, okay, let's start with what you did well. And he was squirmy and he was anxious and he was like, yeah. Okay, I got it. Let's go to the section of what I didn't do well. It's this deficit perspective. We're so focused on what's broken that we don't stop to think about what's great. And it gets in the way of people identifying what they do best.
Why do we do that, do you think? Is it kind of like a false humility that we have? Is it Satan? What is it?
Yeah, such an interesting question. I think we're socialized to do it. So I think
Right.
from a young age, if you think about it, it's a bit painful to watch in my own children. But when they go to school, they're given grades, right? And what are grades telling you? They tell
Mm.
you where you're good and where you're deficient. And nobody stops really to celebrate the A's. And instead they say, hey, you're at a 70 or a 60. We need to really rehabilitate you to get better. So from a young age, you're taught that you're not good if you're not getting an A.
And
And
it's
so
all
we're
or nothing too. If it's like, oh,
totally
you
is.
got straight A's, now we can celebrate. We don't celebrate, oh, you got one A and three D's.
Shame on me, Valerie. You're speaking my language because I'm a parent of four children and I do this. I wrote the book on talent and yet I reinforce this deficit perspective. Naturally, I come home and my kid says, Dad, I got two A's, a B, and two C's. And I'm like, two C's? Why'd you get two C's? Let's talk about that for a second. How do we bring those up to A's? So, why do we do it? I think we're socialized to it. I think that as society, we tend to favor people who are well rounded. And so we want people, it's like, oh, good. It's great that you're good at those few things, but what aren't you good at? And let's bring those up to speed so you can be really well rounded.
Hmm.
I think it's just a part of society, and then Satan, I think, plays on that. I think that he loves to tell us we're not good enough, loves to tell us what's broken. I mean, listen to most talks that happen in church or over the pulpit. Most of them are things that are wrong, like, "Hey, we need to get better at this," or "You need to get better at that." And I oftentimes tell people, I'm a branch president here in Houston, and I try to be sensitive to this, and I tell others, "Hey, when you're talking to youth, they don't need to hear what's broken. They hear that all the time. They need to hear what's great." And let's focus on that. So number one is that deficit perspective, and it's brutal. It gets in the way of identifying talent.
All right. So you said that there's three things before we started that get in the way. So one is that deficit principle. What are the other two?
Yeah, the second one is the scarcity belief. The scarcity belief says there's not enough talent to go around. Like, there's a quota, and God only gave talents to a few people. This one manifests when I was teaching a group of young women a couple of years ago as part of a ward conference. And I started off the lesson and I said, "Raise your hand if you have talents." And only like 3 hands went up. And I said, "Okay, so those of you who didn't raise your hand, why don't you have any talent? Like, why do you think that you don't have any talent?" And they said, "Just don't. I wasn't born with any. I don't have any." Like there wasn't like there as if there wasn't enough to go around, right? And it's painful to me to think that we have this scarcity mindset that only a few people got talent and everybody else got left out. It's just not true, but it gets in the way.
Mhm.
The third one,
That's
Valerie,
interesting.
you mentioned this one just a few minutes ago. You kind of caught on to it already. I call it the humility complex. This one's a little sensitive because we actually value humility in the church. Humility is a great attribute. In fact, you have to have it to live with God one day. But I think humility can sometimes flare out of control. And what happens is when somebody comes up to you, Valerie, and says, "Valerie, you're just a tremendous podcaster. Like you're so good at interviewing people." Your natural tendency is to say, "Oh, shucks, I'm not that good. Oh, that's kind of you, but it was just a good day." Or, "Well, I'm not really doing anything everybody else isn't doing." It's this kind of we feign this humility because we feel uncomfortable with people telling us we're great at stuff. And what happens is we actually begin to believe it. Like when people come up and say, "Hey, that was a great talk you gave." We say, "Oh, no, it was nothing. I just kind of threw it together." And eventually you start to convince yourself that maybe it wasn't anything. Maybe you did just throw it together. Maybe you did just get lucky. It's this idea that if I didn't have to work really hard at this, it must not be all that special. And so it's this humility idea that look, humility is important. I want to be clear on that, but it can flare out of control to the point that we actually talk ourselves out of the very things that we do very best.
I think we have to have another kind of humility too, where we can like accept praise
Yeah. Yes,
and not make the praiser feel bad about giving us a compliment. Um, I know
that's
lots of people
absolutely
hate
right.
giving other people compliments because so many people take them so badly that it's not comfortable to give people compliments. So
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. People maybe that are listening are thinking, "Well, what should I do?" You should just say thank you. You should just acknowledge it. When somebody says, "Hey, that was a really beautiful musical number. You're like the most talented pianist I've ever heard." You ought to say, "Thank you. I appreciate that." And just let it sit. Just let it sink in. Don't talk yourself out of it. Don't say, "Oh, I don't know, I messed up here and I messed up there." And just don't do it. Just accept it. If Father in heaven or the Savior were before you, and if they were complimenting you and saying, "You are so gifted at this," would you really push back against them and say, "Well, I don't know about that. I mean,
I
I'm
think a lot of
okay, but
people
I don't."
would.
They
I think
might
they
actually.
would.
That's true. We've just
Okay,
got to learn
can I
to
add one to your list?
please, please.
Okay, here's what I see is that we believe that people lie when they give us compliments, and that's
Yeah.
why we refuse to believe that we have the talents that we have because we think they're just being nice.
Yeah, we feel like people are like they owe it, like they feel like they owe us a compliment and they don't, and they're just kind of saying it to try to build a relationship. And we overthink this for sure, but I'm with you. We think people lie about it. And by the way, these are just three. There are so many others. Doubt, fear, self confidence or lack of self esteem. the adversary. I mean, there are so many reasons why we don't believe talent. It's actually, I guess it shouldn't be that alarming that we don't know our talents because there's so many things pushing against us,
Right.
identifying that true kind of identity, who we are.
Okay, so if you can work through those things, get past those, how do you um, establish in your mind what your talents are?
Yeah, that's the golden question. So, look, those things are hard. They're going to be pushing against you. I'm not asking you to ignore them, but here's what I am asking you to do. First of all, believe that you have some. We have to start there. And if you can just listen long enough to believe you have them, then here are the ways that I've found to help people figure these out. The first is we've got to get clear about what a talent is. And I love a definition of talent. It says that talents are those things we do naturally, consistently well. The key word there to me is natural. So, in fact, that's the great paradox is because they're so natural, we don't identify them, but everybody else around us does. We've got to begin to get clear about these things that are natural to us. What I found as I've led workshops on talent is that talent is always connected with feeling. So think about moments where you feel motivated, energized, on fire, in control, powerful, moments during the week when you are at your best. The question would be, why do you feel that way? And the answer is because those endorphins are directly connected to the brain synapses that are part of your talents. So if you can backtrack it and start to figure out when am I at my best and what am I doing specifically, at the base of that are talents. So step one, you've got to get clear about emotion. Emotion is the hallmark of talent. When you're using your talent, you feel it. If you're good at something and you're not feeling very motivated by it, it's probably not a talent, but it might be a skill. And there's a difference. Skills are things that you're good at, but may not necessarily love. And I know lots of people that get paid, promoted, and rewarded for their skills, but they don't love their job. They think, I'm not happy doing this, or they don't love their calling. Talents are not those. Talents are very natural. I had one young person a number of years ago. I was teaching a class to a group of sixth graders on talents. I said, what is a talent? And this one little guy in the middle raised his hand and said, it's a superpower. And I got chills. I thought, that's so amazing. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, it's just something you do better than most other people. Those are talents. So step one, you got to identify the emotion. Step two, you have to get clear or understand that there are really three kinds of talents. And most of us only recognize one kind of talent. So play along with me, Valerie, on this. I'm going to use you as kind of my helper to kind of define these three things. So the first kind of talents are called doing talents. Doing talents. They're things that are easily observable. So Valerie, when you think about doing talents, things that we can easily observe in other people, this is the stuff most people come up with very easily. When you say, what are talents? And they make a list. What are some of the things that come to mind for you?
Speaking, singing, playing a musical instrument, some physical related activity, dancing, sports, those sorts of things.
You're right. And that's what most people say. And that's where most people think talent ends. The problem with that is if you don't have any of those, like me, then you start to think, I don't have any talents because I can't, play basketball really well, or I'm not a dancer, I can't sing, or I don't play musical instruments, or I don't bake or cook very well, or whatever it is. The reality is there are actually two other kinds of talents that are just as valid and just as important. The second kind of talents, aside from doing talents, are called feeling talents. Valerie, does anything come to mind when you hear feeling talents? What kind of things do you think might be feeling talents?
I would think that that would mean there are some people that are just very naturally like empathetic
Yes.
or loving. Just it comes naturally to them, and it. I know this because it doesn't for me, so I recognize it in other people where it's just very easy for them.
That's it. Yeah, you nailed it. Feeling talents are empathy. It's the ability to connect with people. It's the ability to be intuitive. You can read a room. You can sense the energy. It's the ability to be positive or motivating. My wife is the most positive person I've ever met. And she just like pops out of bed at 5 a.m. and is like ready to go, just excited for the day. And I have to warm up for a little while, but it's just natural to her. She's a positive person. She gets people motivated, enthusiastic. If you're listening, you may have an outsized portion of feeling talent. You might be really good at connecting, empathizing, motivating, feeling, sensing, intuiting. I think that's a word. Loving, showing compassion, showing kindness. These are all feeling talents. And there are all kinds of careers that are beneficial for those. And in the church, what calling doesn't need somebody with feeling talent, right? Feeling talent is powerful. Now, you may still be sitting there and thinking, okay, I can't dance or sing. I don't feel much for empathy or intuition. Where does that leave me? Guess what? There's still hope. The third category are called thinking talents. Thinking talents are all conceptual, their ability to think abstractly. They could be things like problem solving, um, analyzing, coming up with complex solutions to problems. This could also be things called like retaining information. We all have that friend that listens to NPR or other news channels or podcasts, and they're like a wealth of resource or wealth of random facts. Like you're like, how do you know that? And they're like, I just remember it. I'm like a card catalog, right? Thinking talents. Are there other thinking talents that come to mind for you, Valerie, when you hear about thinking talents?
I think people who are good at math,
Oh,
also
yeah.
not me. Notice I can pick out all the ones that I'm not good at. Um, how about like what's it called when you see a picture memory,
Oh,
photographic
yeah.
memory?
Oh, yeah, totally. Creativity, by the way, falls in this category. If you're a creative person, and I know you probably are, Valerie, I don't know you really well, but I assume because you work in the publishing industry and you do marketing and all the other things that you probably have gifts and creativity. That is a thinking talent. Think about those people that you sit with and say, hey, let's do a quick brainstorm of ideas. And they're the one that just keeps coming with ideas. And you're like, where do these come from? I can't do that very well. Those are all thinking talents. There are, by the way, hundreds of each of these categories. We've only talked about a few today, but as people are listening, I hope they're beginning to say, okay, step one, I've got to pay attention to emotion. When do I feel strong? When do I feel powerful? When do I feel most in control? Step two, I've got to begin to sort them. What are doing talents? Which ones are thinking talents? Which ones are feeling talents? There's a step three to identifying talents, and there are really two ways to do it. The first way to figure out your talents is, interestingly enough, to ask everyone else around you. See, the reality is, and the great paradox of talent again, is that because they're so natural, everyone but you knows them. Like you do them every day and you don't even realize it. So if you will gather 8 to 10 people, and if you will ask them to identify 2 or 3 moments when they've seen you at your best, and then share those with you, you are going to see remarkable consistency. It's a fascinating activity. I have my clients do it all the time. They'll go and pick 10 people, email them and say, will you send me just 3 quick bullets of when you've seen me at my best and what I've been doing? They collect that. They end up with 30 data points. And as we look at it together on that spreadsheet, 2 things happen. Number one, there's remarkable consistency. You start to see it pop off the page. Everyone sees it but them. And number two, it usually ends in tears because it's very affirming for people because everyone around you already knows it. Valerie, all your colleagues know it. All your family members know it. Everyone who knows you knows what you do best. So the first way is to actually ask those around you. The second way to figure this out is simply through self-reflection. It's getting clear, and I call this energy tracking. So what energy tracking encourages you to do is get a note card or a book or something where you can take notes. And at the end of every day, I want you to go write down moments when you were at your best and moments where you felt drained. So usually when I have my clients do this, they draw a line down the center of the page and they put a plus sign on one side, a negative sign on the other side. And at the end of the day, they say, this is the stuff that kind of lit my fire, motivated me, and this is the stuff that drained me. And at the end of 7 days, you're going to start to see some consistencies. You're going to see like, oh, wow, every time I coordinate that podcast and come up with interview questions, I feel alive. Or every time I craft that marketing plan or have time to connect with people or whatever it might be, I feel alive. That starts to give you hints about your talents.
Very interesting. All right,
Yeah.
what else?
So 3 powerful steps. 1, emotion. 2, 3 kinds. 3, get clear about those talents. Just as we're talking now, Valerie, I'm curious, and I know, you're probably thinking about all kinds of things, but I'm curious what talents are even coming to mind for you. Like, what are those moments where you are at your best? Those moments where you feel alive? What are those things that you feel like you might do naturally well?
I am definitely not one of those people that is not clear on my talents. Um, I'm very clear on what my talents are. And I think my greatest strength and talents is my creativity, as you
Mm,
already pointed out. And I think that's very, very true and probably very obvious to people because I've been told that my whole life. Um, and my creativity extends into kind of like little fingers into a lot of other talents
yeah,
that I utilize with that creativity that kind of go hand in hand. So I have a talent to be able to organize and put together pieces of things that are kind of difficult for other people to see how to um, tie things up in a nice little pretty bow. I'm pretty good at that. And then I also have a lot of like crafty abilities. I'm very artistic and I like music. I like to sing and I like to create all sorts of different things in tons of different media. And that's probably like, the top of the iceberg part that you can see. And then I probably am less clear on some of those, feeling talents and thinking talents that you can't see as well. But I know I've got
yeah.
some. It's just hard to verbalize them, put on the spot. Give me a week to journal in.
You know what? And that's the hardest thing is just simply to articulate them. Most people
Yeah.
don't take the time to just sit and do the hard work of reflecting and writing these things out. This is what I challenge clients to do. I say, I want you to just come up with 3 to 5 talents. Most people can really thrive on 3 to 5 talents. And I want you to define them. Like, what does it look like or what does it mean to you? And you gave a great example, even just now live on this podcast, put on the spot. You gave a great example when you said, I can organize things very well. You didn't just leave it at that. You said, I'm really good at taking information from disparate places and finding a way to synthesize it in a way that makes sense. That's a beautiful definition. Like, I think, wow, that's powerful. Like, how awesome would that be for a boss or a manager to know that about you? Like, oh, that's what Valerie does best. How about a bishop or a relief society president to know, like, this is Valerie's gift? Like, I just think, if we can put you in a place to be creative, to organize, to articulate, to sing, you've got creativity, artistic ability, you're crafty. If we can put all these things together, we're going to unleash a really powerful person. And so it's all about you getting clear and then helping other people around you identify these things and know what you do very best. And so I applaud you. Like, well done.
Well, thank you. I'll take that compliment and not make it weird by diminishing it. Um, so, how would you advise people to go about expressing these talents to people, like you were just saying? Like, if I wanted to do more within my ward or at work, how would you advise me to express this to my boss or the bishop or the Relief Society president?
Such a great question. So for everybody listening, there's two. This is reciprocal. There's two parties that have to be involved in this. And let me talk first to leaders. Leaders, this is crucial. You have to ask. You have to ask. I was meeting with a bishop recently. We went to lunch together and we were just talking about being a bishop, and he said a really interesting thing to me. I was telling him how I sometimes struggle to find people to feel certain callings. Like, I put people in callings and they don't really want to be there and they struggle. And I say, "How do you handle that?" And he said, "Well, first of all, before I ever give a calling, I ask people where they want to serve." I said, what? What do you mean by that? He said, I literally sit down with people and say, welcome to the ward. What would you like to do? And I said, really? Doesn't that take the inspiration out of it? He said, no, information precedes inspiration. And how can I get inspired if I don't know what they do very best? So I asked them, I say, what are your talents? What do you like to do? If you could have any calling, what would it be? And he said, it's never really gotten weird or awkward. People just tell me straight up. So I tried it. I sat down with an individual in my branch who was struggling in their calling, and I said, what would you like to do? Like, where do you want to be? Do you like kids? Do you like adults? Do you want to teach? Do you like to administer? Do you like to lead? Like, what do you like to do? And they told me exactly what they do. They're like, this is what I do very best. And they told me all about it. And suddenly it was like a no brainer. I'm like, oh, wow. Then why am I putting them in a place where they're just struggling and languishing? Why not to put them where they can be magnified? And so leaders, and this goes for bosses at work as well, you've got to ask your people. If you don't, it's no different than buying a really beautiful, complex appliance and throwing away the instruction guide and just using it for something it's not intended for, right? It's like buying a blender and using it to go out and like clean the pool and like, turn it on. It's like you would never do that, right? Well, but it spins and it mixes. That's not what it's for. So human beings are complex, we're dynamic. You've got to understand what they do best. To those of you that are on the other side, who don't have a leader that's asking you the question, there's a couple ways you can do this. I have my clients develop what I call a profile of self or a user's guide. And it's just that it's a user's guide for how to work best with me. It's a one-page document, and it has on it everything from what they believe, their core values, to what their talents are, what they do best, to the type of environment they do their best work in. Like, do I like fast paced, slow paced? Do I like being around people or not so much? And I have them put this into a one-page document, and they call it User's Guide to Self. And they develop their user's guide, and then I challenge them to go sit down with their manager and say, hey, I wanted to share some things about me just so that you know, and so that I can add more value here in the workplace. And people have had tremendous success doing this because instead of tippy-toeing around each other and having these awkward interactions and not really knowing how to work with each other, we just get really clear right off the bat, like, hey, here's who I am when I'm at my best. And it really helps that manager figure out how to put you to work. In a ward, it'll be a little more tricky, right? Like, you're probably not going to go to your bishop or your least steady president with a user's guide to self. But here's what you can do. Let me just tell kind of maybe a final story or two. I was meeting with a group of high school seniors down in South Texas, and there were 200 of them in an auditorium, and the client had hired me to come and teach them in an hour and a half how to identify their talents so they could go pick a career. So I got into that auditorium, Valerie, and I said, raise your hand if you have any talents. And in 200 kids in the room, how many hands do you think went up, Valerie? 200 people. How many do you think raised their hands, said, I've got talents?
I would say probably like 12 to 20 max.
Isn't that wild? And 200, guess what the answer is? One.
Oh, wow.
One kiddo raised their hand and said they had talents. And
Oh.
so we dove in and we started to talk about this. And I taught them what I taught you today about talents and what I teach in the book. And we worked through some exercises. And at the end of that hour and a half, I said, raise your hand if you identified a talent today. 200 hands went up. Everybody in that room had identified a talent. I said, oh, that's wonderful. Keep your hand up if you'll share that talent with everybody else. Every hand went down. I said, whoa, wait. What just happened? Let's try that again. It's an interesting social experiment. Raise your hand if you found a talent. Every hand goes up. Keep it up if you'll share it with everybody else in the room. Every hand goes down. I said, okay, tell me about that. What just happened? Why are you putting your hands down? You know what you do best. Why are you not raising your hand? And they all sat there in silence and stared at me awkwardly. And finally, one kid in the front says, because what if I'm not as I think I am? And then another one speaks up and says, what if people laugh? And then another one speaks up and says, what if everyone expects me to do that and I fail? Well, it's too risky. And they all started to talk about it. Doubt, fear, anxiety, all those things that get in the way. And my challenge to them, and it'd be the same for the listeners today, what can you do in your ward You can raise your hand. Raise your hand. When somebody says, "Who will teach the lesson next week?" and deep in your soul, you feel like that's you, raise your hand. When somebody says, "We need somebody to coordinate this committee or this service project," and you think to yourself, "I'm really good at organizing things," raise your hand. When somebody says, "We need somebody that's willing to speak or willing to teach this class or willing to lead these children or willing to," raise your hand. More importantly, when you're sitting in your presidency meeting, raise your hand. When they say, "Who wants to take charge of missionary work? Who wants to take charge of family history work?" raise your hand. It's the key, Valerie, to doing this in a ward is you've just got to step up and raise your hand. And you've got to be willing to put yourself out there and maybe fail and maybe not do well, but at least put your talents to work.
Well, I imagine that bishops and branch leaders are not looking for people who are the best at things. They just want people who are willing to serve, right? So I would imagine that would be more important.
It's all the Lord wants. There's a quote that I'm going to butcher, and I wish I knew it, but I think it was President Monson who talked about the Lord just wants somebody who's willing. And if you'll just be willing, then he'll do the rest, right? So he's not looking for expertise. And I believe that's absolutely true. I think we've got to be willing. That same bishop, by the way, that I went to lunch with, texted me just recently. He had read my book and he said, "Hey, I've got an idea. I'm thinking about bringing it to ward council, and I want us to talk about what our talents are in ward council and figure out how we could be deploying those talents to serve our members. And then I want to ask about how we can figure out how to help our members use their talents." I pushed on him. He said, what else would you tell me to do?" I said, "One other thing I would encourage you to do. Challenge your presidencies to sit together in presidency meeting. And I want them to do two things. Number one, I want them to reflect back to each other their talents, because the counselors know what the president's talents are. The president knows the counselor's talents. If you'll just take some time as a presidency to share with each other what each of you does best, it's powerful. It'll bond you. You'll feel united. The second thing I want you to do is look over your list of responsibilities. And instead of delegating responsibilities randomly, try doing it according to talent. Like try saying, "Hey, here are the 9 things that the primary presidency needs to get done. What do you love to do? What do you do very best? Where do you feel most confident?" And you'll probably put, if you're Valerie in that primary presidency and I were the primary president, I would for sure put you in charge of music and probably some type of artistic thing or craft, or ask you to help me create this new thing to really magnify the primary program. Or perhaps I would ask you to organize and synthesize information. But I would want to put you to work where you serve the very best. That's really the key.
I want to share just a quick funny story about that you bring that up, because I've been the primary chorister 4 times in 4 different wards. After I had been the chorister 3 times, that 4th time, I decided I wasn't going to tell anybody in this new ward that I had ever been a primary chorister. And so nobody knew. Nobody knew. And they called me into the office and they said, we don't know if you even feel comfortable doing this or not, but we'd like to call you to be the primary courser." And I just started laughing because it was just so surreal and funny that I had tried to keep it a secret, but I couldn't keep it a secret from the Lord. So
God knows you. God knows you, and he knows how to magnify that talent. Now, to that point, though, you bring up an interesting thing. So just one maybe final thought here is that there might also be areas where you can stretch and grow. And can you continue to develop talents? Absolutely. God has said in the scriptures that you can build talents and grow talents from nothing. And so although we should put people where they serve very best, there's also opportunities to stretch people. And so my caution would be to that future bishop out there that when Valerie comes to your ward and she's been a primary chorister 4 times, that's great. And if she loves it, then, and you feel inspired, then do it. And I bet, Valerie, you have many other talents that could really be magnified in that ward, and you probably use them in your ward. But I just wonder how many people kind of get stuck. They just kind of are doing the same
yeah.
thing. And there've got to be other opportunities. You have so many talents. I mean, just today in 60 seconds, you listed 5. Chorister is one of them. But wow, I mean, I think I could see you being so powerful in so many different ways.
Well, thank you. All right. So I don't usually do this, but I want to give people an opportunity to learn more about you and what you do, because
Mm.
you don't just talk about this on podcasts and write books about it, but you have a business.
Yeah,
So you have your business side where you coach people and companies on how to utilize people within a professional landscape, right?
that's right.
So tell people about that and where they can find information about that, because I think people are going to want to know.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The easiest way to track me down is at proofleadership.com. The name of my business is Proof Leadership Group, and we go into companies and do exactly what you described. We try to help managers figure out how to work better with team members to build a great culture. And that all comes from knowing what people do very best. So proofleadership.com. My email is Dustin at proofleadership.com. And then I built a course called the Purpose Blueprint.com, which helps people dig into this. I've just bumped into too many people over my career who they suffer, they struggle, they don't know their purpose in life, they don't know what they do very best. And so the purposeblueprint.com, people can go there and figure out their talents and their values and what they do very best. They can build that profile of self. I just found that self-knowledge is truly a gift, and it's what God wants us to do. And so that's what we do. And I appreciate you asking. And that's what we go and try to help people do in their businesses to just create better places of work for people.
I mean, it really can bless your life to understand what your strengths, or in other words, your talents are.
Yeah.
Um, for me personally, I would not be here. I love my job at Cedar Fort. I love all the stuff that I do here. I do a lot more than just the podcast.
Hmm.
And I think that if I wasn't the type of person that embraced my talents, I would be languishing at some boring 9 to 5 job that I absolutely hated and wanting to die every day. But instead, I come to work, excited to talk to people like you, be part of these conversations, and be part of something that I really believe in. And I had no idea that this is where I would end up,
Right.
because, I spent um, most of my adult life so far raising my children at home, and that was important to me. And so when I was kind of done with that, my youngest went to kindergarten. I was like, well, what am I going to do now? I haven't done anything for all these years, and now I need to get into the workforce. Um, but I think because I was aware of what my talents were, it helped me end up somewhere that I really love. So
That's the
there's
key.
proof positive for you that this
That
is a really good thing. It's a really good thing. I've had a lot of fun talking to you today about all of this.
Thank
So
you.
thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. That is the key, Valerie. It's and maybe can I close out with this final quote? This is from the
Absolutely.
book. This is from President Kimball. He said, Jesus knew who he was and why he was here on this planet. That meant he could lead from strength rather than from an uncertainty or weakness. The key words to me were he knew who he was. Much like you, the way to answer the question, what should I do with my life, or what would God have me do, is figuring out who you are. It's not trying to kind of pick a career arbitrarily. It's figure out who God made you to be, and it will surface, it will manifest. And I absolutely believe that's true. So I appreciate you having me on the podcast today. It's been fun. It's gone fast, and appreciate you making this happen.
All right. Thank you so much.